Harlan Webb's neighbors mocked him for months about the root cellar he was digging into the hillside behind his house. Dale Hutchins told him at the co-op that he could buy 2 chest freezers for what he was spending on stone. Ray Polinski said the same thing, just quieter. Harlan didn't argue with either of them, and by October, the cellar was loaded with 380 pounds of potatoes. The ice storm arrived in January and took the power out across 3 counties for 2 weeks, and every freezer in the valley went dark. Harlan Webb was 64 years old and farming the same 180 acres in Texas County, Missouri, that his grandfather Henry had cleared in the 1,930 seconds. The land sat in the Ozark Hills, rough and rocky, the kind of ground that produced decent hay and tough cattle but didn't make anyone rich. Harlan ran 40 head of beef cattle and put up hay each summer, and Ruth kept a garden behind the house that covered nearly half an acre and fed them through the year. He wasn't a large operator, and he didn't want to be one. The farm was enough. Henry Webb had built a root cellar into the hillside. Behind the house in 1947, the year he came back from the war and married Harlan's grandmother, he dug it into the north slope where the sun never hit, lined the walls with limestone from the creek bed, and laid a white oak roof across the top with 2 feet of earth over it. Henry stored potatoes, carrots, beets, onions, and cabbage in that cellar for 30 years, and he kept a spiral notebook on a nail by the door with temperature readings written in pencil. The cellar held between 34 and 42 degrees year-round, and Henry never lost a crop to rot or freezing in 3 decades of use. The cellar collapsed in 1994 after a wet spring softened the hillside, and the sidewall gave way. Harlan was 35 years old, recently married, and busy enough with the cattle and the hay that he filled in a hole and moved on. He bought a chest freezer the same year, a 15-cubic-foot Kenmore, plugged it in on the back porch, and started storing his garden produce the same way everyone else did. It worked fine for 20 years, and then it didn't. The Kenmore's compressor failed in 2019, and Harlan lost everything inside it. 60 pounds of green beans, 40 pounds of sweet corn, 20 pounds of ground beef from a steer he'd butchered that fall. The freezer was under warranty, and Kenmore sent a replacement compressor, but the warranty didn't cover the food. 3 years later, a power surge fried the control board on the same machine, and he lost another season's worth of produce before he figured out what had happened. The warranty covered the board, but the food was gone again. Harlan stood on the back porch after the second failure and looked at the hillside where Henry's cellar had been. The ground was flat, now covered with fescue, and there was nothing left to mark where the door had been. He'd been relying on a machine that worked when it worked and failed when it failed, and each failure cost him more than the one before it. He went inside and found the notebook. Spring 2022. Harlan walked up the hillside on a Saturday morning in March, carrying Henry's notebook and a tape measure. The ground was still cold, the fescue brown and flat, and he couldn't tell where the cellar walls had been. But Henry had drawn a map on the first page, showing the distance from the southeast corner of the house to the cellar door. Harlan paced it off, 42 steps, and drove a stake into the ground at that spot. The drawings were precise. Henry had diagrammed the cellar in cross-section, 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, 7 feet high, at the peak, 2 ventilation pipes, one near the ceiling, one near the floor, a gravel floor over a drainage trench, a door facing north. Beside the measurements were temperature readings, dated entries from 1948 through 1972, the year Henry's eyesight failed and he stopped writing. Harlan took the notebook to the kitchen table and showed it to Ruth. He told her he was going to rebuild the root cellar, the same design, the same location, the same materials he could manage. Ruth looked at the drawings and asked why now, after 28 years without one. Harlan's answer was specific. The rural electric co-op had 3 outages the previous winter, the longest one lasting 4 days in February, when an ice storm took down a transmission line north of Kabul. The freezer had held that time, because the temperature outside was cold enough to keep it below freezing, but it had been close. Another day without power, and the food would have started thawing. He wasn't preparing for the end of the world. He was fixing a problem he'd already lived through twice, and the notebook told him exactly how to do it. Henry had written the temperature readings the way another man might write down financial accounts, and the numbers were consistent across 24 years. The cellar never dropped below 34 degrees, even in January, and it never rose above 42, even in August. Those were the numbers Harlan needed, and they were sitting in a spiral notebook on his kitchen table. He spent the next 2 weeks measuring the hillside and marking the outline with stakes. He dug a 2-foot test hole and filled it with water to check drainage, and the water was gone in 4 hours, which meant the soil was sandy enough to keep the cellar dry. He confirmed the slope faced north and checked the area above for tree roots that could crack the walls. There was one white oak 40 feet uphill, but its roots ran toward the creek. The site was clean. Harlan ordered the ventilation pipes, the PVC, the screening, and the lumber from the hardware store in Kabul, and he spent $300 on stone from a quarry in Houston, Missouri. The total cost of materials came to just under $800. He kept the receipts in the notebook, on the page opposite Henry's drawings. Harlan started digging in May by hand with a shovel and a mattock 3 hours every morning before the heat set in. Mow. The Ozark soil was rocky, and he pulled out chunks of chert and limestone the size of his fist, stacking them along the hillside for the walls. By the end of the first week, he had a hole 3 feet deep and 8 feet wide, visible from the county road. Dale Hutchins drove past Harlan's house every morning on his way to check his cattle on the south farm, and on the 3rd day of May, he stopped his truck and watched Harlan dig. Dale was 58, farming 300 acres of fescue and cattle, and he ran 2 chest freezers on his back porch that held 2 steers' worth of beef every fall, plus whatever his wife Carol put up from the garden. He leaned on his truck window and asked Harlan what he was building, and when Harlan told him, Dale laughed and said he hadn't seen anyone dig a root cellar since his grandfather died in 1982. He said Harlan could buy a chest freezer for less than he was spending on stone. Ray Polinski heard about it the same week at the feed store in Kabul. Ray was 61, farming 220 acres, and he'd built a walk-in cooler in his barn 3 years ago with an electric compressor and insulated panels he'd ordered online. It held the pork and beef from his annual butchering and ran on a circuit he'd wired himself. Ray didn't laugh when he heard about Harlan's cellar, but he said the same thing Dale said, just quieter. He told Harlan that a walk-in cooler was more reliable than a hole in the ground. Cody Marsh was 32, 3 years into running his father's 160-acre operation, and he drove up on a Saturday in late May to look at the cellar site. He asked questions about the depth and the ventilation, and Harlan showed him Henry's notebook. Cody studied the temperature readings and asked why the cellar stayed cold without power. Harlan explained that the ground at 4 feet deep held between 50 and 55 degrees in Missouri, and the ventilation pipes pulled cold night air in during fall and winter, dropping the cellar into the high 30s. Cody didn't mock it, and he didn't commit to building one, but he asked if he could come back and see it finished. At the co-op in Kabul the following week, Dale told 3 other farmers about Harlan's project, and one of them called it Harlan's Cave. The name stuck. Harlan heard about it from Ruth, who'd overheard 2 women talking at the hardware store. She told Harlan that people had always talked about things they didn't understand, and Harlan didn't respond to any of it. In June, Harlan hit a layer of shale at 6 feet down, right where the cellar floor needed to be. The shale was dense, and his mattock bounced off it. On the 2nd day, he noticed water seeping from a seam in the rock, slow but pooling in the bottom of the excavation, with nowhere to drain. He spent 2 days worrying about it, going back and forth to the hardware store, checking whether Henry's notebook mentioned water, and it didn't. On the 3rd day, Harlan dug a narrow trench along the back wall, 6 inches wide and 8 inches deep, running from the shale seam to the front of the cellar. He filled it with 3/4-inch gravel and ran a 2-inch PVC pipe through it, extending the pipe out through the hillside below the doorframe. The water found the trench by the end of the day and ran out through the pipe in a thin, steady stream. The cellar floor stayed dry. Harlan wrote in the notebook, The 14th of June hit shale at 6 feet, water from seam. Drainage trench and pipe installed, floor dry. Harlan built through the summer, working mornings and late afternoons when the sun was off the hillside. The cellar measured 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 7 feet high at the peak, the same dimensions Henry had drawn. He quarried the limestone from a shelf of rock on the back 40, near the creek, splitting it with a feather and wedge set that had belonged to his father, driving wedges into drilled holes with a sledgehammer until the rock split along the grain. He hauled each stone to the site in the bed of his pickup, backing it as close to the excavation as the slope allowed. He laid the walls by hand, fitting each stone against the next without mortar, relying on weight and angle to hold them in place. The technique was called dry stacking, the same method farmers in the Ozarks had used for field walls and root cellars for 100 years. The walls took 3 weeks to build, and by the middle of July they were up to the peak. Harlan stood inside the cellar and looked at the joints where the stones met, wedging smaller stones into 2 gaps near the top, until the daylight disappeared. The roof was white oak from a tree he'd felled the previous winter. After a windstorm cracked the trunk, a neighbor with a portable bandsaw mill cut it into 8-inch beams, 12 feet long, rough sawn, and still smelling of tannin. Harlan spaced the beams 18 inches apart across the top of the walls, notched the ends flush against the stone, and secured them with oak pegs he'd whittled from scraps. Over the beams he laid tar paper and 2 feet of excavated soil, raked and seeded with fescue. By August, the hillside looked undisturbed, except for the ventilation pipes and the door frame set into the north face. He installed 2 4-inch PVC pipes, following Henry's design. One ran from near the ceiling out through the hillside above the door, angled so rain couldn't enter. The other dropped to near the floor, bringing in fresh air. He screened both ends with 1/4-inch mesh to keep mice out and curved the pipes so debris would run off. Cold air is heavier than warm air, so cold night air sank through the low pipe and pushed the warmer, stale air out through the high one. It was a passive system, with no moving parts and no power source, the same design that had worked for centuries. The floor was 6 inches of 3/4-inch gravel over the drainage trench, raked level and packed down. Gravel held moisture from the ground and kept the humidity high without holding standing water, which was why Henry had used it and why the root cellaring guide Ruth had ordered recommended it over concrete. The gravel stayed damp through the summer because the hillside retained moisture below the surface. The door was the last piece, 2 layers of plywood, with 2 inches of foam insulation between them, set into a treated lumber frame bolted to the stone walls, facing north away from direct sun. He built the shelving from rough sawn oak, 4 shelves on each side, each 1.5 inches from the wall for airflow. He hung a thermometer and a hygrometer on the back wall, where he could read them the moment he stepped through the door. By the 3rd week of August, the cellar was finished. Harlan stood inside it at noon on a Saturday, when the temperature outside was 95 degrees and the air was heavy enough to taste. The thermometer on the back wall read 58 degrees. The hygrometer read 74%. He knew both numbers would drop as the ground cooled into fall, the same way Henry's readings had dropped. Henry's notebook showed the cellar finding its operating temperature by October and holding steady through the winter. Harlan wrote in his own notebook, the 19th of August, 58 degrees, 74% humidity, cellar complete. Ruth brought him a glass of water while he was sitting on the gravel floor, looking at the stone walls and the oak beams. She stood in the doorway and looked around for a long time. She said Henry would have recognized it. Harlan said that was the idea. October 2022. Harlan dug his potatoes on the 2nd Saturday of the month, pulling Kennebecks out of the ground by hand, shaking the dirt off and laying them in the grass to dry. He'd planted 12 rows in May, and the yield came to 380 pounds, filling 6 bushel baskets and part of a 7th. Kennebecks were a late-maturing variety that his father had grown for years because they stored through winter better than any other potato he'd tried. The skins were thick and the flesh was dense, and if they were cured properly, they would keep for 5 or 6 months in the right conditions. Curing was the step most people skipped, and it was the reason most stored potatoes rotted within 6 weeks. Harlan spread the potatoes on burlap in the barn, away from direct light, and left them for 10 days at around 55 degrees. The curing let the skins toughen and the small cuts heal, sealing each potato against moisture loss and decay. He checked them twice, pulling out any with soft spots to eat first. By the end of the 10 days, the skins were set and the potatoes felt firm and solid. He loaded the cellar on the 15th of October. The potatoes went into burlap sacks on the bottom shelves where the air was coolest. The carrots and beets went into wooden boxes packed with damp sand that Ruth had helped prepare, each root buried so they didn't touch. The onions went into mesh bags, hung from the ceiling beams where the air was driest. The cabbage went on the top shelves, each head wrapped in newspaper to slow the release of ethylene gas, which could cause other produce to sprout and rot. When he was done, the shelves were full. The cellar smelled like earth and roots. He checked the thermometer and the hygrometer before he closed the door. The temperature read 39 degrees. The humidity read 90%. The gravel floor was damp from ground moisture, and he could feel cold air moving through the low ventilation pipe and warm air pushing out through the high one. The numbers were exactly where Henry's readings had been, in October 1948, the first entry in the old notebook. Harlan covered the potato sacks with an extra layer of burlap to block any light that might enter when he opened the door, and then he took out his notebook and wrote everything down. The 15th of October, 2022, 39 degrees, 90% humidity. 380 pounds potatoes, 60 pounds carrots, 40 pounds beets, 30 pounds onions, 12 heads cabbage. No spoilage at loading. Cure completed the 14th of October. He closed the insulated door and walked back to the house. Behind him, the cellar disappeared into the hillside, the door flush with the north slope, the ventilation pipes hidden in the grass. There was nothing to mark it from a distance, except the fescue growing over the roof, and that looked the same as the rest of the hillside. Harlan checked the cellar once a week through November and December, and the temperature never moved off 38 degrees. The potatoes sat dormant in their burlap sacks, the carrots crisp in the sand, the onions dry in their mesh bags. Everything was exactly where he'd left it, and it would stay there until January. The 12th of January, 2023. The forecast on the radio called for freezing rain overnight, with temperatures hovering around 30 degrees and a moisture layer moving up from the Gulf. The Ozarks got ice storms every few years, and they were destructive because the freezing rain coated everything, every branch and wire and fence post, with a layer of ice that built up over hours until the weight became too much. The power usually blinked, but came back within a day. Harlan had lived through 6 or 7 of these storms in his time on the farm, and none of them had caused more than a few days of inconvenience. This one started at 9 in the evening on the 12th of January, and didn't stop for 36 hours. The freezing rain fell steadily through the night, coating every surface with a glaze of ice that thickened by the hour. Harlan could hear the branches cracking in the woods behind the house, sharp sounds like gunshots, and by morning the trees on his property were encased in an inch of clear ice that bent the tops of the oaks to the ground. The power went out at 2 a.m. on the 13th, and Harlan heard the pop from inside the house when the transformer on the county road blew. He walked the county road on the morning of the 14th, picking his way through downed limbs and broken branches. The power lines were down in 3 places between his house and the paved road, and 2 of the utility poles were snapped at the base, the wood split by the weight of the ice. The damage ran in every direction as far as he could see, and he could hear generators running at 2 of the neighboring farms. He walked a mile down the road and turned back. The damage was too widespread for a quick fix. The Rural Electric Co-op posted an update on their website on the 15th of January, which Harlan read on his phone because the cell tower still had power. Widespread damage across Texas County, Howell County, and Shannon County. Dozens of snapped poles. Transmission lines down across a 3-county area. Estimated restoration was 5 to 7 days for most customers, longer for remote locations. The estimate was revised on the 17th of January to 7 to 10 days, and revised again on the 19th to 10 to 14 days. Each revision added time, and each addition meant the freezers were 1 day closer to failing. Harlan checked his cellar on the morning of the 14th, the day after the power went out. He opened the insulated door and read the thermometer. 37 degrees. The hygrometer read 92%. He pulled a potato from the top burlap sack and turned it over in his hands. It was firm, dry, the skin unbroken, no sign of sprouting. He checked the carrots in the sandbox, pushing his finger into the sand to feel the moisture level. Damp, but not wet. He looked at the onions hanging from the ceiling, dry and papery, the same as the day he'd hung them. He looked at the cabbage on the top shelf, the newspaper wrappers intact, no smell of rot. Nothing had changed. The cellar didn't know the power was out because it had never depended on power. The ground temperature held the walls at a constant 38 degrees, and the ventilation pipes pulled cold air in and pushed stale air out the same way they had in October. Harlan pulled the door shut and headed back inside. He didn't tell anyone about the cellar. Not yet, because there was nothing to tell that would change what was happening to the people around him. The 18th of January. 6 days without power. The temperature outside hadn't risen above 28 degrees since the storm, which meant the freezers were warming faster than they would in summer. A freezer holds its temperature for about 48 hours if the door stays closed, and after that the food starts to rise toward room temperature. But room temperature in a house without heat in January, in the Ozarks, was 45 degrees and dropping, and the freezers were becoming irrelevant. Dale Hutchins opened his freezers on day 5, when the smell told him it was too late. The beef was soft, the packaging puffy with gas, and the ground venison Carol had packed in September was leaking through the freezer bags. He moved what he could to coolers, packed with snow from the yard, but the snow was melting, and by the 6th day, the coolers were full of water. He carried the meat to the burn pile in plastic garbage bags, 10 bags that represented 2 steers and most of his family's protein for the winter. 700 pounds of meat, processed and frozen, and now rotting on a pile of brush behind his machine shed, Ray Polinski's walk-in cooler, died on day 3. The compressor ran on electricity, and when the power went out, the cooler became an insulated room with no cooling, warming faster than a chest freezer because the volume was larger. He had 200 pounds of pork, sausage, and a half hog in the cooler, and by day 4, the sausage was soft and the pork was gray. He lost everything. Ray had built the cooler himself, wired the compressor, sealed the panels, and he'd been proud of it. Now it was an empty room that smelled like spoiled pork, and the compressor was a machine that couldn't do anything without a wire to bring it power. Cody Marsh lost a freezer full of sweet corn and garden vegetables, and by day 6 the corn was mush and the beans were fermenting. He called Harlan on the 20th of January to ask if Harlan was doing all right, and Harlan told him he was fine. Cody said he'd lost everything in the freezer and that his wife was driving to Springfield for groceries because there was nothing left in the house that didn't come from a can. Harlan said he was sorry to hear it. The co-op posted another update on the 22nd of January. Restoration for the most remote locations was now estimated at the 27th of January at the earliest, with some areas potentially pushed to the 28th. Harlan's road was listed under the remote locations, which meant he was looking at 15 days without power from the start of the outage. He read the update on his phone and then walked up the hillside and opened the cellar door. 37 degrees, 92% humidity. The potatoes were still firm, the carrots still crisp, the onions still dry. He closed the door and went back to the house and put a log on the fire. The 27th of January, 2023. The power came back on Harlan's road at 4:47 in the afternoon, 14 days after it went out. Harlan was splitting wood when he heard the well pump kick, on a low hum from the basement he hadn't heard in 2 weeks. He walked inside, turned on a light, and the bulb came on. Nothing in his cellar had changed during the 14 days the power was gone. Dale Hutchins drove up 2 days later, on the morning of the 29th of January, without calling first. He walked to the door and asked Harlan if he could see the root cellar. Harlan walked him around the house to the hillside and pulled open the insulated door. The cold air came out in a wave, and Dale stood in the doorway staring at the thermometer on the back wall. 38 degrees, 91% humidity. Harlan pulled a burlap sack of potatoes from the bottom shelf and opened it. The potatoes were firm and dry, the skins unbroken, no sign of sprouting. He pushed his hand into the sandbox and pulled out a carrot, crisp and orange, the same color it had been in October. He cut a beet in half with his pocket knife, and the inside was dark red and dense. He set the halves on the shelf and stepped back. Dale didn't say anything for a while. He stayed where he was, looking at the stone walls, the oak beams, the shelves full of produce. Finally he said, 14 days I lost 700 pounds of beef. He didn't say Harlan was right, and he didn't apologize for the jokes at the co-op. He lingered in the cellar for another minute, then walked back to his truck and drove away. Ray Polinski came the next day and asked about the ventilation pipes. Harlan told him, 4-inch PVC, one near the ceiling, one near the floor, screened at both ends. Ray asked about the gravel floor, and Harlan told him, 6 inches over a drainage trench, holding the humidity at 90%. He asked about the temperature, and Harlan told him, 38 degrees in January, the same as October, the same as Henry's readings for 24 years. Ray wrote the numbers on the back of an envelope and left. Cody Marsh came on the 2nd of February with a spiral notebook and a pencil. He asked Harlan to walk him through the cellar from the ground up, covering the site, the drainage, the walls, the roof, the ventilation, the shelving. Harlan answered each question with specific detail, and Cody wrote everything down, page after page, the same way Henry had written his temperature readings 50 years earlier. He asked about the cost, and Harlan told him, $800 in materials, 3 months of labor, no electricity. Cody asked if Harlan would help him dig one in the spring, and Harlan said he would. After Cody left, Harlan went back up the hillside and checked the cellar one more time. He wrote in his notebook, the 2nd of February, 2023, 38 degrees, 91% humidity, 310 pounds potatoes remaining, 55 pounds carrots, 38 pounds beets, 22 pounds onions, 9 heads cabbage, no spoilage, no sprouting, no loss. He stood in the cellar and looked at the shelves. Nearly 5 months of storage, through an ice storm that took the power out for 2 weeks and ruined every freezer in the valley. The numbers were the same as Henry's numbers. The method was the same as Henry's method. The only thing that had changed was that no one else in the valley had one. February 2023. Harlan stood in the cellar with a lantern, the same way Henry had 75 years earlier. The shelves were half empty, the produce diminishing through winter the way it was supposed to. The potatoes that remained were still firm, and not one had sprouted. He closed the notebook, turned off the lantern, and pulled the door shut. The latch caught, and the cellar disappeared into the hillside. Cody would dig his in the spring.